Hello there. It looks like we're having some video problems. We'll be getting going in just a minute. Ah, there we go. That looks a little better. Okay, we'll be getting going in just a minute then. Alrighty. Thanks for coming out tonight. Today's talk is going to be a little look at kernel exploitation, why you should care about it, and some of how it happens. I see my microphone is peaking. I'm going to turn that down. Hopefully that sounds a little better. Anyway, let's begin. So, you got a shell. Pretty cool. You found some bug in a program. You've gotten, at code execution, you've done something. You popped a shell. Congratulations. But what next? On some systems, you might be root already. Some particularly hilarious systems, you'll be in the kernel already. But in most cases, you're probably running as some kind of random user, possibly a relatively unprivileged user, has access to just what it needs and nothing more. So that's kind of lame. Being root would be a lot more fun, I think. Because what if we could just do whatever we wanted? We could just have full access to the system. We could, steal the flag or, whatever it is we're there to do. So what we want to do is privilege escalation. And we kind of talked about this before, I believe. But privilege escalation is anytime we go from a less privileged position to a more privileged position. You could argue that just logging into an admin account is a form of privilege escalation, although it typically describes unauthorized escalation. So somebody getting access they should not have, using that initial foothold. And this is really big for malware, for I guess CTF. Most of the time it's just something malicious, obviously, but it's also comes up in things like jailbreaking. We're trying to find a way to trick the device into giving us more permission than we should have. Same for rooting an Android phone, which might actually give you root in the process. So we should have a quick look at what the kernel is and why we should care about it. So the kernel is kind of the core of your operating system. It's what actually interfaces with your hardware. So when you write a program, it does not really care what exactly, your system looks like. It just cares that the operating system will give it access. And in a sense, the operating system, some parts of it might not really care. They just ask, the kernel, hey, figure it out. But the kernel is where the buck stops. It's what actually says, okay, well, you want this kind of nice abstract view of your machine. Well, I'm going to have to give it to you. So it handles all sorts of things. It handles, access to memory and devices and your file system, going to the network, synchronizing processes, all that good stuff. It has a lot of power and a lot of responsibility as a result. So most stuff that you actually run and interact with is outside of the kernel. Most stuff. There are exceptions. So your browser is running in user land, we also call it, versus kernel land or user space and kernel space. There's a lot of different nicknames given because there's such a fundamental concept. And so the actual operating system is kind of sitting over on the kernel side. It's actually talking to your CPU and your devices and all that kind of stuff. And so that privilege boundary, that separation between user land and kernel land, is extremely important. So this hierarchy is actually enforced in hardware. If you kind of ever wondered, like, well, what stops me from just doing it if I want? Well, the answer is that the processor itself actually has different modes of execution. Nominally, modern ones have 4 different rings, although as it turned out, we really just wanted 2. User land, where things can just go haywire and crash, and we don't care, and kernel space, or kernel land, which is ring 0, which is where we have to be careful. Because if something goes wrong in user land, you get a program crash. Something goes wrong in kernel land, your computer blue screens. Because there's just so much less protection. There's so much more access going on at that, privileged execution level. So if the kernel is what handles the actual kind of, invocation of, reads and writes and all that good stuff, it's actually kind of talking to your hardware. Well, how do we get it to do it for us? Obviously, we can't just let people just kind of say, hey, kernel, run this. Here's a function pointer, have fun, because that's almost certainly going to lead to a catastrophe. So instead, there's a very narrow set of access points to the kernel, ways that user space code can say, hey, do this for me. And these are syscalls. You've almost certainly kind of seen these before, at least heard of them. They there's hundreds of them, and they handle all sorts of things, opening a file, reading and writing. I don't want to list all these, it's kind of boring, but they do a lot. Now, a system call is actually an opcode. On x86 32-bit systems, I believe it was int80 or int OX80. It was a particular interrupt. But on 64-bit systems, it's actually an instruction. It's called a fast syscall. And so that's actually an instruction there. It's not like you can't just, call a certain function and, oh, there we go, we're doing a syscall. No, it's actually the processor doing this for us. Because again, there's a lot of kind of interplay between the processor and the operating system and, your code at this point. So we have to actually invoke that opcode. So libc, which is, the kind of base library that you build most, like Linux programs from, gives you a lot of wrappers that you don't have to actually write the assembly, because that kind of sucks. So this as an example here, your shell is basically just reading a line, forking and executing it, and then waiting for it to complete. And so when it calls, for example, open, it's going to actually make a buff, it's going to actually make a syscall and do that. I was the second example here, just reading a file. We get a buffer and we, ask, hey, open this for me. Then we ask it, okay, read some stuff in and then, write it out to stand it out. So all of these are done by syscalls, and syscalls are really the only way your program interacts with the world. Without system calls, your program is kind of sitting in a little room, just making heat and not doing anything of use, really. And that is quite important. So these things are how we actually break out of that box. So they better be pretty efficient, I'd hope. And the actual transition is pretty exciting. So when you actually invoke a syscall, you're basically telling the processor, hey, figure that, do the syscall thing. Again, we can't just tell it, hey, run this code for me, because then we could just tell it, run this malicious code for me. And we could just get arbitrary kernel code execution, which is bad on the scale of kind of bad things. It's near the top. So what happens is it actually looks at a model-specific register, or MSR_L star, which boot, the operating system kind of writes to that, says, hey, here's where the system call handler is. And ARM has a similar thing. I think the vector-based address, something like that, vbar. And so, again, these things can't be touched by a normal user. Because, again, otherwise, we could just say, okay, instead of going to the syscall handler, go to me, Pretty bad. So you can't do that. And there's a whole gigantic pile of these model-specific registers. It's quite interesting. I would suggest having a further look separately from this talk. So that's syscalls. And an important thing to consider is what you can actually access at any given time. So in a user space process, you have a specific blob of virtual memory you can work with. Like you have ranges that you're allowed to touch. And these translate back to actual physical addresses at some point. But as far as the program is concerned, it just has these ranges. You might recognize like this offset here. That's you see that a lot in challenges because that'll be kind of where the program starts. And then the stack is all the way over here, growing down towards 0. So when we make a syscall, we go from ring 3, which is user land, to ring 0, kernel land. And the kernel is allowed to see everything. Because you think about it, if I want to say, read some data into a buffer, well, I'm asking the kernel to do that. So the kernel must be able to see that address and see that buffer. Otherwise, it couldn't do anything. And some of you might already be thinking, well, hey, hold on. That could get dangerous. And it could. But we'll come back to that later. Although we're going to talk about it now, really. Because when processing pointer arguments, the kernel has to make sure that these are actually valid pointers. Because what if, for example, I said, oh, here's my buffer. Please read some data from into that. And instead of giving us an actual valid pointer, they give us a kernel address. So that would result in the clobbering of kernel memory, which would probably lead to the machine crashing shortly afterward. Because again, when the kernel messes up, there's nothing you can really do other than crash instantly. You're in an unstable situation, and you don't know what's being messed up, so nothing is safe. Thus, you just turn off instantly. So to get around this, we have these actual operations that check if the buffer is below the address limit, and that's basically the cutoff between the kernel and between user land. So if the address is high enough, then we'll be fine. But if it's, or I should say, if it's low enough, we'll be fine because the kernel lives way up here at the top. You see, it's up. I believe it used to live down at 0 in 32-bit systems. Not sure off the top of my head, but yeah, it lives way up here. So if that pointer is too high, it must be a kernel pointer. And we just say no, don't do that. So there's some basic protections there, and there's some kind of things that keep us from just telling the kernel, hey, do this for me, and it just obliges. So that doesn't happen. At least usually doesn't happen, as we'll see shortly. So how do we actually exploit the kernel? So we are here in user land, and we want to get to where the cool kids are, ring 0, the kernel. So the juiciest way to get in is just to attack the kernel, and that has happened. I mean, unsurprisingly, it's a gigantic pile of C. It would be surprising if there weren't exploits in it. But the kind of core kernel code of, say, Linux is very carefully checked. There's a lot of people looking at it. There's a lot of people attacking it constantly. Because if you could find a bug like that, that is either a great blog post or a great payout from a 3-letter agency. Because this is what gets you from, kind of ho-hum, user land access to kernel access and, and beyond. So it happens, but this probably isn't what you'll be doing. Fortunately, third parties write massive amounts of buggy code and deliver them as kernel modules, or on Windows, you'd probably know that as drivers. So these are, your buggy NVIDIA drivers, your buggy weird RGB mouse drivers, whatever you have going on. And so these things are running in the kernel, and they're often written by third parties that may or may not know what they're doing. So that can lead to some hilarious situations, such as buggy anti-cheat modules, which we talked about quite recently, actually. Because if those get popped, then that's kernel access. So, you gotta be careful. And if you just do a little ls mod to see all your kernel modules, you probably got a lot. So if any one of those is vulnerable, then you could be in deep trouble. So as I mentioned, kernel code is written in C. And C is not quite as much of a foot gun as C++ can be, but it certainly doesn't stop you from just blowing your foot off. You can get all kinds of hilarious errors with, bad heap memory management, stack problems, just all kinds of things. So in the user space, our main goal is figure out a way to get a shell. And then, if we can break into kernel space, our goal is to get root. Because if we can get root, we probably, root is already probably enough to do what we need. The kernel does have more power, but root does have quite a bit of power already. If we just want to steal some files or something, that's all we need. But we can still abuse the kernel to get access to root. Because, unsurprisingly, the kernel is able to, modify permissions. It's able to do basically anything. So, today's focus is on that last little bit. Because, let's be honest, who isn't already sitting on an O-Day? I got one in my back pocket, I swear. So, a really basic way to exploit the kernel here is what we might call ret to user. Or return to, user space. So suppose that in the kernel we manage to screw something up so that, a function pointer gets set wrong, or something happens, or maybe you return to the wrong place, and you manage to make the kernel jump to userland. Well, now we've got code executing with, ring 0 permissions, or kind of in supervisor mode, I believe it's called. But it's in the user land, and so we could put our own code there. And then that shell code is going to get executed, in ring 0, and we can do whatever we want. As long as you don't crash the machine immediately, which is quite easy, actually. But if we get kernel execution, what do we do? Because we're not popping a shell here. There's no syscalls in the kernel. We're already in the kernel. So what do we do? Well, the kernel controls, privileges of processes. So in theory, we could just say, okay, well, make me root. So process credentials are stored in a cred struct, and so each process in Linux in this case had a task structure that contains a pointer to its credentials. And there's some functions that will, make a structure for us and apply them. So, if we just make ourselves a root struct and then, apply it to our current process, well, we're root now. So now we can just pop a shell and, hey, it's root. Now, if we safely return to user space, if we return safely, mind you, that's pretty challenging, then we might need to pop a shell and go on. If we don't safely return, this machine just blows up and dies, and the exploit is all for naught. So we need to actually find these functions, because we don't actually know where they are necessarily. So fortunately, /proc/klsims contains some symbol addresses. And so we can just page through that to figure out where they are. And you'll notice, again, these are way up there in that kind of kernel memory region. So we find prepare kernel cred, commit creds. Yeah, there we go. And so what we want to do is just call commit creds with the result of preparing kernel creds. And so this is just a shellcoding exercise. And so we wind up building something like this. We'll spend too much time staring at the individual opcodes here, but you can assemble that online and get yourself some bytes. So here's kind of the roadmap for this exploit. We jump to user space with shellcode at that address. We execute the shellcode, which will run commit creds with the result of preparing a root kernel root credential structure, and then safely get back to the user. Because if we just run off and return to some bogus pointer and crash, that's a kernel panic. The system is dead. So again, that has to be saved. Otherwise, what's the point? And at that, if we safely return, spawn a root shell, go nuts. Now, if we were together in person in the CII building, we would be actually trying to do this kind of collaboratively. Alas. However, we do have the challenge files on the tools website, if you'd like to have a look at them. If you go to tools.rks.ec, you're going to find links on there to the challenges, as well as these slides if you need them. So you can just extract them and have a peek. But we're going to have just a quick look on stream here at one of the challenges. So let's wake up our VM here. All right. So this is just the challenges folder after extracting it. Let me make this a little more readable for y'all. Let's see. I always forget where this is located. Let's see. Where are you? I'm going to change the font size on this thing. Here we go. And let's just bump that up a little. I accidentally blew up my VM, so I have a fresh copy. So, challenge 0 here. Let's have a look. So, this is a kernel mode calculator, because that's exactly what we need. I think that's a great idea. So what this thing will do is just you write to /proc/calc, and it will take two things and perform a math operation and spit the result out into the kernel log. Not the most practical thing in the world, but it's illustrative. So the way this works is this uses QEMU to actually just run a little machine. So if I just do run with chal0, we are now running a machine in here. And I can say, okay, so I'm this no privilege user. I can't read the flag here. That's sad. And what I can do here is say, okay, cat 12 times 12 to, let's see, proc calc. Oh, wait, not cat, echo. And hey, there we go. So we could also say, okay, well, what if I give it just like a number? Well, it doesn't like that. It says, okay, invalid argument. Now I'm going to do a dot product, because that's a good thing to do. And, maybe not. So that was a kernel panic. The system is now dead. And if I scroll up here, yeah, we see, not a valid operator. Ooh, dereference, null pointer. We're hosed. So why'd that happen? Well, if we look at chal0 again here, we're going to see that what it does is it picks the appropriate function pointer, like madd, msub, etc., and runs it. But if we don't give it a valid opcode, it doesn't set it. So this is actually just 0, hence a null pointer. But what if we put something there? So suppose we were to, let's just write a copy over a little tack here. Let's see, find the right one. There we go. So let's run that again. Oop, wrong folder. And just spin that up. Okay. So we're going to go into temp, because everyone can write temp. And let's make a little component file. And we'll paste this in. Let's have a look at this. So we just map some memory at 0. Now that's normally not actually possible. And we'll get on to like the mitigations that prevent really trivial attacks like this from working. But it's kind of illustrative to have a look at it anyway. So what's going to happen here is we map some memory at 0, ORX 1000 bytes of it, and we just shove some cell code in there, mcopy it in, and so now if someone tries to dereference 0, specifically the kernel tries to dereference 0, they're going to wind up hitting that shellcode, and they can actually execute it. And so this, again, invokes that cred function, and then just, runs it and returns. And then we give it an argument that winds up making it bug out and write. So when this write happens, that kernel code gets called, and when that terminates, we come back to here. And so now we can just bin sh. So let's give it a try. Oh, I'm mad at them. Okay, let's just gccu and pwn. So you'll notice that our little character here changed to a octothorpe pound sign. I don't know what to call it. Hashtag. You can get whatever you want. And if we who am I, we see that we're now reviewed. So that gave us privilege escalation. And if I control D, I pop back to my normal shell, control D again, leave the machine. So if you can get the kernel to run whatever code you want, then game over. Let's pop back to our slides here. So, as I mentioned, that's usually not possible. You're not allowed to just map 0. Because what that winds up doing is making it really easy for a null pointer error to turn into code execution. Typically, you want to just make the system die whenever 0 is dereferenced, no matter what. Like, it just should not be legal. Because that just means that a null pointer is suddenly a real point, a valid pointer. So typically, it's not that big. It's just a little bit. But that's enough to break this exploit. Unless, of course, we can corrupt it into trying to dereference 10,000. But that's kind of obvious there. So we can't really bypass this. Like that's kind of just it's set in stone. There's nothing really fancy going on here. A little fancier is Kazler, or kernel address space layer randomization. This is a lot like kind of the userland equivalent, ASLR, or just address space layer randomization. The important thing here is that you can't just kind of scramble the kernel around constantly. Like, you can imagine if you just kept changing the offsets, then nothing would be where it should be and the system would just die. So, the randomization happens on boot and no other time. So, if you can go check where those symbols are, then you'll be fine. You just have to make sure you do it and actually, shove the new address in when you run the exploit. So yeah, that's pretty straightforward. It takes a little more work, but you already have a shell here, so you can read it. Unless kpointer restrict is enabled, in which case only root can actually ask where these symbols are, which just seems kind of reasonable. To get around that, we need to leak a kernel pointer, and this is again very similar to attacking ASLR. We need to leak a pointer, figure out what the offset is, and then compute where we want to go. A little stronger is SMEP and SMAP, I'm going to call it, or SMEP and SMAP, supervisor mode execution or access prevention. And again, this is really similar to a concept in userland. Windows might call it data execution prevention. You might know it as WZORX, write or execute, write XOR execute, or just don't execute data. And what these do is prevent the execution of code in user space with SMEP, and then SMAP prevents memory access from user space, so that we don't accidentally work with a user space pointer when we weren't expecting it. You do have to, it has to be disabled when you actually want to touch user space, but it means that if a kernel module is written terribly and doesn't use the correct functions to actually touch user space memory, it'll catch it. And an SMEP will just prevent you from actually running code at all, which makes sense. You probably just shouldn't be executing arbitrary bits of memory as code in general, especially if it's in user space. So to get around this, this is a broken record at this point, but we do something very similar to what we do in userland, ROP. So we need to actually say, okay, well, I'm going to find some bits of kernel, code, all of which is valid and it's allowed to be, executed. But when we just, chain it togetherness in a way, so we have to hijack the return point or get ourselves running code at some point in the kernel. But if we can do that, we can just bounce around the kernel to glue together some gadgets and give us a, code execution. There's also ret to dir, which I'm actually not too familiar with. Return to direct map memory, but it's just another bypass technique. I might go into that further sometime down the road. So let's just suppose that there's also mitigations against messing with control flow. We talked about this kind of recently, the concept of the shadow stack or other general things that make sure that we're not returning to a bunch of weird locations. So control flow integrity. Just let's say, okay, that's happening. We cannot do that. But suppose we get arbitrary read and write. Well, at that point, we basically won again, because we just need to figure out, okay, suppose there's some bit of memory that says you have root privileges, and if we just go find that, poke it, well, we got root. No arbitrary code execution required. We're working entirely within the bounds of this extremely buggy kernel module. And there's a lot of a lot of targets here, structures and function pointers and all sorts of fun things. If we can just hijack some of that, we're we'll be able to do a lot of damage. Because you can imagine, if we can rewrite a function pointer, we control the ship now. So earlier on, we talked about those credential structures, and that how every task, so every process, has a pointer to its credential structure. So those are both somewhere in the kernel heap, somewhere. Again, heaps are dynamically allocated, so they're kind of hard to predict. And we have a peek here, we have pointers to cred and real cred, but generally both the same thing. And you'll notice those are right next to the tasks, like the name of the process. So if we just put some funny stuff as the name so we could look for it, we could then just scroll through the heap until we find it. And once we find it, we could mess with things. So if we zeroed out the UID, that would mean that UID is 0, and that's the UID of root. So there we go. So we can set the process name. That's no obstacle, and then just try to find that name, and there we go. So let's have a quick look at that. This will be challenge. Let's see, challenge 2, and this has a really buggy kernel module. It's just it allows us to leak a heap pointer, and then just write to some point in memory. Not exactly the most secure module, but this is kind of a simplification of the hilarious stuff actual buggy kernel modules will wind up doing. So let's see here. So what we want to do is actually say, okay, well, I want to find myself in the heap, and then I want to just offset myself a little bit, and then just zero out that memory, and we should have root. So I'll pull in file here again. Let's see, let's run us this challenge. Same deal as before. And we're just going to pop into the temp. Let's see, phone.c, insert. This will be a little longer. We won't stare at all of this, but let's have a look regardless. Oh, sorry, I just pasted in the victim file, not the exploitation file. That might be the wrong thing. Let's just do that again. I love doing it live. Okay, let's try it again. Home.c, insert, give ourselves, there we go. So we're going to say, all right, give me a heap pointer. So we leak that heap pointer because we need to know where to start looking. Otherwise, we'd have a very large swath of memory to search through. And we give ourselves the classic screaming process name. All A's. So, 41414141, so on. And all we need to do then is say, okay, just take a peek at this memory address. If we see all A's there, we've probably found our process name. So we will just subtract 16 or 10 from that. And if you remember looking back at the layout of that the code here, our name is here, and then minus OX8. Here's cred, and then minus OX8 again. Oh, here, real cred. So that will be where we want to clobber, or we want to read and then go to it and clobber, I should say. So we find that location. We use our extremely buggy kernel code to just zero out the memory there, and so now our UID is suddenly 0. So let's just GCC that and get a few warnings, some exciting stuff. There we go. So as you can see here, we started at, a base pointer here, and then it just kind of prints out as it scans. So we're just walking through kernel memory 8 bytes at a time, checking if we have the right name. And if we find it, well, then we just dereference that pointer. Again, this is all in the buggy kernel module. And we then tell it to, just zero that out. We just write it all to 0. And at that point, our process is now root. And so we spawn a shell, and who am I? We're root. And we capture flag. That's a terrible flag. So that kind of just about wraps things up for this little look at the kernel. So some interesting things to look at further. Pwnable.kr is some reasonably challenging things related to kernel exploitation. W3 Channels as well, a good place to look. We also have a link to some write-ups and old challenges on GitHub here. You'll want to jump to our slides links. You can actually follow these links. Obviously, you can't see this one here, but you just need to go to the tools website, go to the slides. You can scroll down here and follow these links. Also, we got some old labs from Binary Exploitation. I should check these are still alive. Yes, they are. Excellent. I was a little worried for a sec. That's back in 2015. But yeah, so we can take a peek at those. MBE has some very good content. I suppose I'm a little biased here, but I think it's quite good. So definitely someone to look. Now, also a great book is A Guide to Kernel Exploitation, Attacking the Core. So yeah, all these are nice pieces to look at. And finally, I would suggest checking us out on Slack. You join us there, we can answer any questions you have and point you in the right direction. So with that, that wraps things up for today. So as I just mentioned, join us on Slack if you're interested in kind of catching further talks. We're doing them every Friday at 7 Eastern Time, barring any weird exceptions. Then in the future, we're looking at doing a few fun things with stuff like code execution, video games, and the kind of the basics of heap exploitation, which is a particularly relevant topic for kind of modern CTF challenges. There's a lot of weird heap stuff out there. But yeah, so that's the end of the slides. Thank you for coming, and we hope to catch you here next week.